Chapter 3, Settling a New Land. As you read in your text, Boonesboro was not the first permanent settlement in Kentucky. It was Harrodsburg. There were people in Kentucky, the Long Hunters and the Indians, but again, the first permanent settlement in Kentucky was Harrodsburg in 1774, although it would be 1775 before the building of Harrodsburg would begin. The textbook gives you little information about James Harrod. Some people find James Harrod to be one of the most interesting men in Kentucky history because there's a number of mysteries about him. For example, we do not know his exact date of birth, nor the exact time or how he died. We do know what happened in between. He was born sometime after 1742 and before 1746. He was born in Pennsylvania. He was one of 12 children, and his dad was John Harrod. James has little formal education, but was far from illiterate. He kept well-written records. He was also quick to learn Indian languages and was fluent in French. Like so many of the early colonists, his life was shaped by Indians. His father's first wife and one of his brothers had been killed by Indians. As a child, he remembers his mother and brothers and sisters fleeing the cabin before Indians would attack. As they looked back, they could see their home burning and hear their friends crying out as they were being killed by the Indians. Yet after all this, he never hated the Indians, nor did he kill them indiscriminately. However, he did become an excellent marksman and a very good hunter. Harrod was a tall man with jet black hair and a full beard. He served in the militia in 1755 and also served in the French and Indian War. After the French and Indian War, like so many others, he succumbed to the lure of the land across the mountains. First, he went to Illinois and made trips down to present-day Kentucky and Tennessee. On one of his trips to Kentucky, he would meet Daniel Boone. We know that Harrod was here in Kentucky in 1770 and in 1773. In 1773, he was on the survey party where he disappeared, and he would go to look for a place to set up his own establishment. In 1774, Harrod left Pennsylvania with 32 men and traveled down the Ohio and up the Kentucky River and established a small settlement. They drew lots on who was going to live where. Due to Indian problems, Harrod would leave the area in October 1774 and would return in 6 months. He started building a fort when he returned and discovered that the McAfee brothers were already there. This would be one of the first disputes over land ownership, and it would not be the last. It would be settled peacefully, but there will be lawsuits later. Meanwhile, a man by the name of Judge Richard Henderson and his Transylvania Company are in the area. Harrod and other colonists did not accept Henderson's dominance or his claim that he owns all of Kentucky. Harrod would lead a successful protest against Henderson. When Virginia created the county of Virginia, it made Harrodsburg the county seat, and Harrod was elected the county representative and would be able to attend the Virginia Assembly. Twice, in 1776 and 1777, Harrod led groups eastward to get provisions and gunpowder. Although we had a lot of land and a lot of game, gunpowder was one item we were short on. He and his men would have several fights with the Indians. He also led several difficult expeditions against the Indians in what is known as the Northwest Territory, which is the land north of Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Herod led these difficult expeditions in 1780, 1782, and 1786. By the time the Revolution is over and peace comes to Kentucky, in time, the Revolution is over and peace comes to Kentucky, Herod would settle into the life of a very well-to-do farmer. With his accomplishments, he acquired more than 20,000 acres across the state. He had one main farm that he worked with six slaves. He had cattle, sheep, hogs, and horses. All this time, he's been busy. He is a veteran of the Revolutionary War, the French and Indian War, and Lord Dunmore's War. He is a good Indian fighter and a well-respected man. Herod's been, like I said, he's been busy and he's not had time to get married. Soon he would meet a cultured 22-year-old widow with a young son whose first name was also James, and he fell madly in love. Herod, he's in his middle to late 30s at this time, and it would take 7 years before his wife, Mrs. Herod, gave birth to Herod's child, a daughter, and not the long-awaited son that James wanted. He would come to think of his stepson as his own. In November 1787, young James is captured by the Indians and burned alive at the stake. Herod took his stepson's death extremely hard. To cope, Herod began to take long hunting trips, days, weeks at a time. During the winter of 1792, right after we had become a state, he would take a long hunting trip and he never returned. We are not sure what happened, if he was captured, killed by the Indians, if he had an accident, or did someone else kill him? Did he die of an illness? Did he just keep walking and just never return? We just don't know. His widow would marry again shortly after his disappearance. However, after a few weeks of being married, she decides to have the marriage annulled because she knows that her husband is alive. After the annulment, she says that James is dead and that someone has found his bones, and she applies for his pension. Now, she could not get his pension if she remarried. Another rumor is that a man by the name of Bridges killed Herod, and that he found the skeleton with his clothes. There's no known gravesite for him. There's no known date of his death. The winter of 1792 is the last time he was seen alive. He would never gain the fame that Daniel Boone did. And you may ask why. I may wonder why he never gained the fame that Daniel Boone did, even though he did so much for Kentucky. Perhaps because no one ever wrote a story about James Herod. Back in the pioneer days in Kentucky, if you planted the crops and you erected a structure, Virginia would recognize you as having a land claim. Herod did have crop planted, and he had a structure erected before the McAfees showed up. In March of 1775, Daniel Boone blazes a wilderness trail The first documented account between Henderson and Boone is sometimes in the 1770s. Judge Henderson issues an arrest warrant against Boone for non-payment of bills. Judge Henderson agreed to cancel the warrant and clear his name if, and only if, Boone would lead his expedition into Kentucky for him. Your textbook explains how supposedly Henderson bought the land from the Cherokee. On their way out, 3 men were killed by the Indians. Some settlers would actually leave. Some would die. Indians left. Meanwhile, Boone has sent this letter to Henderson telling him to get his butt over here, or telling him to get his butt out here with help and supplies, and that the Indians are after us. When Henderson finally arrives, the Indians are gone, and they're even having some trouble finishing building the walls because there's no Indians. There's just no fear. Let's just do our own thing. Would not take long for there to be a food shortage. Again, as far as on a food shortage, you just may ask why there would be a food shortage. When they first arrived, there is an abundance of deer, antelope, and buffalo. When you kill animals close to where you live, the game doesn't return, doesn't come as close. Additionally, the further away you are from settlement, you become a target for the Indians. In June, Daniel leaves and he goes to Carolina and gets his wife. His wife Rebecca stayed home because she was pregnant, and he returns to find her in her 9th month of a difficult pregnancy, and the baby ends up dying. Now, Richard Callaway, he does not like Boone. He believes he should have been placed in charge of this business, the expedition, by Henderson. Callaway has a higher rank in the militia. He's older than Boone and believes he's better than Boone. And he will cause problems for Daniel. Next, we'll look at Richard Henderson. Just giving you some information here. On August 27th, 1774, a land speculation company called Richard Henderson and Company was organized by a North Carolina judge named Richard Henderson and a group of other prominent men from North Carolina. The company name was soon to change to the Louisa Company, and then on January 6, 1775, the name would change again to Transylvania Company. The objective was that through the signing of the Treaty of Shoals with the Cherokee Indians, a proprietary chartered company would be able to purchase approximately 17 million acres of land from the Indians, even though the Indians did not actually own this land. The story of that company and the Transylvania colony are told from the early history of Colonel Henderson through the hiring of Daniel Boone to blaze the wilderness road, and the establishment of Boonesboro through the social and economic life of the Transylvania Company. So I found a picture of Judge Henderson just in his judge's outfit. And basically what Henderson wanted, he wanted a kingdom, not just the land. We don't know who Benjamin Logan was traveling with when he left. He went to a place called Asaph, and which later became known as Logan's Fort, one of the better known and well protected forts. Logan was a good hunter and a dead-eye shot. John Floyd would come back from Carolina with 30 men. He decided not to go to Boonesboro and instead went to Logan's fort. Floyd and Logan and Boone and Harrod were gone a lot to scout for Indians, to hunt for food, to be able to provide for their family. So next we'll look at George Rogers Clark. He is educated and from a well-to-do family. He's a true frontiersman. He's a good leader and well respected. Clark was born on a small plantation in Charlottesville, Virginia. His family was middle class. He had a tutor to come to the house to teach him to read and write. And back at this time, this was done for the oldest son. If you wanted to be a lawyer, you would just go to his office and study under him, as there were no colleges at this time. In 1772, at the age of 20, Clark decided it was time to leave home. He gets a job as a surveyor with the Ohio Land Company, and he would work as a surveyor for 4 years. He did some guide work for settlers, land claims for himself and his family. When he came to Kentucky, he fell in love with the beautiful lands. The only problem was the Indians. They believed that the land was theirs and was very defensive if anyone tried to take their land. At the beginning, when the revolution is fading, the British are encouraging Indians to kill settlers and supplying them with ammunition. So I'll go back and repeat that. Just at the beginning, when the revolution is fading, the British are encouraging Indians to kill settlers and supplying them with ammunition. Clark calls a meeting of all the different forts and settlements to elect someone to go to Williamsburg and see about getting some help. Now, you kind of know if you've ever arrived somewhere late, if you've ever been late to class, you might be called on maybe to answer a question or to lead a group assignment or something. So Clark, even though he called this meeting, he arrived late to this meeting. And he found out that he was one of 2 men that was voted to go to Williamsburg to seek assistance. When he arrives in Williamsburg, the Virginia Assembly has disbanded. The new governor of Virginia is Patrick Henry. And at this time, Henry, he's sick and at home in bed. And he refuses to talk to Clark. Clark will use his family connections to see Governor Henry. Governor Henry explains that there's nothing he can do. He's busy setting up a new government. This is a new country. We're getting ready to fight the British. We have so much to do here that we cannot be concerned over a few hundred people over the mountains. So Clark would seek help elsewhere from the Spanish, and this is the last thing that Virginia wanted him to do. And at 24 years old, Clark was given command of Kentucky's new militia. And Clark would also say that if a country's not worth protecting, it's not worth claiming. So again, as I stated earlier, he would seek help elsewhere. So 500 pounds of gunpowder was donated by Virginia and Governor Henry. A new county of Virginia would be called Kentucky County. And Clark also declared Henderson's purchase void, which made everyone happy. And in your text, it also just goes over life living in a fort. So just, I've listed some advantages. Of course, you have the walls. have other people there. You won't be bored as far as having someone to talk to and just to help with chores. It's invincible to arrows. At this time on the forts, there was a couple called Martins and Ruddles. Uh, the disadvantages of living in a fort, again, just with other people, disease would spread easily. There was no sanitation. The smell was wretched, just horrible. If you ever used the bathroom in an outhouse, this wasn't an outhouse, or if there was, again, wherever they used the bathroom at, just the stench, the smell, just horrible. They had no privacy, and forts were small and dirty. But again, it did provide protection from the elements, from the weather, and from the Indians and from animals that may try to get in. The forts would be soon under attack by the Indians and not the English redcoats, although the Indians tried to go underground, but they abandoned that. It was just too much trouble. Just for the stations, some of the stations may have had one or two cabins for defense. Numerous stations, although they would often just be temporary. So do make sure that you read Chapter 3, and the textbook is New History of Kentucky by Harrison and Clotter.